Yeah, so hello, I'm Baram. I'm going to be talking about work I did this summer with my mentor Tomasz on measuring the beliefs of language models during chain of thought reasoning. Yeah, so just to kind of outline what I'll be talking about, I'll go over some background and motivation for my work, and then I'm going to talk about 3 different methods that I looked at for trying to measure the beliefs of language models. I'll go over what each of these entail in a bit. I'm also going to talk a bit about some models of bounded rationality that I explored, looking at trying to apply them to understanding the reasoning processes of language models. Okay, so first a bit of, I guess, motivation behind this project. So I think a lot of interpretability work tends to kind of focus on just understanding transformers and language models on a sort of single token level, just kind of looking at like a single forward pass or whatever. I really think this is like not enough to understand to really understand how LLMs behave in practice, because of course in practice, they're used autoregressively, processing lots and lots of text and generating text, and then reading the text that they wrote themselves. And I really think that to understand this kind of behavior, we need to kind of take a longer timescale view of things. We can't just look at like a single token level. And one area in particular where this kind of thing comes up, I think, is looking at the behavior of language models with different kinds of scaffolding. So scaffolding can refer to a lot of different things, but essentially it tells different techniques of like modifying or enhancing the prompts, the outputs, ways of like structuring the behavior of language models or integrating language models with other tools and systems, basically in order to kind of enhance the behavior of language models. A lot of different examples here. The most kind of simple one, which I'll be focusing on, is like chain of thought. There's a lot of different varieties of that. By the way, can people see my mouse? I don't. Let's see. Yes. Okay, you can see my mouse. Great. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah. So there's lots of different varieties of chain of thought. There are more exotic things like tree of thought and graph of thought. There are systems integrating language models with planners, like Augustine talked about the other day. There's various like agent-based systems. And yeah, all of these things can kind of enhance the abilities of language models or give them qualitatively new abilities, right? Things they basically couldn't do without any kind of scaffolding. And this can really change the danger landscape of language models, really change the kinds of risks they pose, and generally, I think, increase the risks. Luckily, I don't have to convince you of this, because yesterday OpenAI went and released this model, this new O1 model, in case you've been living under a rock for the last 24 hours or so. So this is a new model that OpenAI released, which is trained to spend more time thinking through problems before they respond. Essentially, I think what they did is took a model, had it go through chain of thought and to solve like various problems, and stuck that in a sort of reinforcement learning loop so that it like improves its ability to perform chain of thought and solve problems. And it's designed to it's designed to work through problems in runtime. So they show here that you can kind of improve performance both by scaling up the train time compute, but also the runtime compute. That is like how much time it spends working through the problems, in context after training. And of course, this has lots of safety issues. So Apollo did some testing of this beforehand and found that it sometimes instrumentally faked alignment during testing. It strategically manipulated task data in order to make its misaligned action look more aligned to its developers, proactively explored its file system to test for the presence of developer oversight before acting on its misaligned goal. They argued that it has the basic capabilities needed to do simple in-context scheming. On a cybersecurity task, they observed that reasoning skills contributed to a higher occurrence of reward hacking. The example also reflects key elements of instrumental convergence and power seeking, and Meter could not confidently upper bound the capabilities of the model during the period they had access to it, which, if I remember correctly, was not very long. Anyway, that's probably fine. But they actually made one kind of interesting claim in the post about this, which is that the fact that it uses kind of chain of thought to do a lot of its reasoning actually makes it more safe in a way, because we can actually inspect the reasoning process pretty easily, right? Rather than doing a lot of its reasoning, sort of implicitly and having to like look at the weights and activations or whatever, we can just read the text that it's looking at. And I think this is definitely true to some extent. It's definitely easier to read a chain of thought, than it is to look at to do like mech-interp or whatever. But it's definitely not perfect, right? So they mentioned here, that there are issues with the faithfulness of chain of thought reasoning. There are a couple other, cool examples along this line. So this paper here, they looked at what happened. So if you ask a language model, a multiple choice question, and you just look at like the raw logits of like the first token, look at the raw logits of like the answer options, and like measure the probabilities that way, which is a kind of very common procedure for measuring probabilities, like when doing like multiple choice benchmarks or whatever. I think I do it later on in the presentation. You actually get different answer distributions than you would if you let it kind of respond freely. Even if like the responses are just kind of like meaningless filler like this, right? Like, here's my response, you wouldn't expect that to change the results. But it turns out that it does, and they find that this kind of meaningfully changes the performance of the models. There's also this well-known paper here that showed that if you literally just give it filler tokens like ... instead of a chain of thought, the language models are actually able to do somewhat better than like just a baseline without any sort of chain of thought. So they're clearly doing some sort of computation even when the chain of thought chain of thought so to speak is just like some dots, right? So this is really interesting, and I'm not going to be working with like cases like this in my work. I'm going to be using examples where we do actually have like a chain of thought that we can read. But the point of showing you all of this is just to kind of argue that there's a lot of really complex, really interesting stuff that can happen when you employ language models like, when it's not just generating a single token, when it's acting like over time, over a sequence of tokens. There's a lot of complexity there that's not captured by looking at like just a single token, and is also not captured just by reading the results that you get, right? So neither of those is really sufficient. You have to do more work to understand what the language model is doing. When it's kind of generating text like this. Okay, so that's the kind of basic motivation for my project. So in terms of the particular things that I worked on, I actually kind of started out looking at models of bounded rationality and seeing if we could use them to kind of describe the beliefs of language models during chain of thought reasoning. So models of bounded rationality were sort of developed to describe human reasoning, which of course isn't always going to be optimal, right? But it might it might be trying to approach optimality, at least sometimes. So it'd be interesting to apply them to language models to see if there's some sort of like belief state that the language model tracks while it's doing reasoning, and maybe it updates it in some way as it like sees more evidence or whatever. And yeah, the particular kind of angle that I was interested in was seeing if like was seeing how it varied with LLM size. So you can imagine this acting as a sort of like a measure of like the coherence of like a chain of thought process that's somewhat like independent of accuracy, because if you imagine like a large language model, a really strong model, it might get a question wrong, but like if you actually look at the reasoning process, it's like mostly still reasonable, right? It like takes kind of reasonable steps. It just maybe has one or two mistakes in it. Whereas if you look at a much smaller model, you could have a case where it just like kind of flails around randomly, goes in all sorts of different directions in the chain of thought, but just by chance ends up getting the right answer, right? So it would be cool to have a kind of measure of the like coherence of the thought process that's to some extent independent of whether you actually end up at the right answer. And that's what I kind of hope that we could do with these models of bounded rationality. Yeah, but to do all of this, we first have to actually measure the beliefs of language models during chain of thought. And this kind of turned out to be somewhat non-trivial, right? It's not actually clear, at least to me, doing this, working on this project, how to measure these, how to measure beliefs properly. Yeah. Okay. So just kind of, I guess, some background on chain of thought. I guess this is kind of the simplest sort of scaffolding method that you could come up with, where you essentially just tell the model to think step by step, maybe give it some like few shot examples to kind of help it along, so that instead of just kind of immediately giving the answer to a question, it kind of goes through an explicit thought process, writes out some like partial computation before giving the answer. Of course, humans wouldn't be very good at like a lot of problems if we had to we have to answer the first thing that comes up into our heads, right? And neither are language models. So letting them or kind of inducing them through various prompting techniques or whatever to take a bit of time to think things through really can kind of help performance in a lot of cases. Okay, so yeah, so how do we measure beliefs during chain of thought? There are one kind of very natural approach is to use linear probes. This is a very kind of common technique used in interpretability research. And so in this context, what it would mean is you train a model, you get the activations of a language model while it's doing some chain of thought problems, and you train a linear probe to predict, like from the activations while it's doing this chain of thought, what the ultimate answer it's going to give is, right? So you train it to try to predict the final answer that the chain of thought is going to give. And the hope would be that this kind of measures the what the language model currently thinks the answer is while it's kind of working through this process. But this isn't kind of a slam dunk, I guess. There's some conceptual issues here with this approach. So in particular, this is only really going to measure what the model is kind of representing explicitly in its activations, right? So you can imagine a scenario where like the model is maybe like collected all the information it needs to, or it's got all of the information it needs to like give the answer like somewhere in the chain of thought, right? In the like text and in the in its like responses to the text. But it just hasn't like integrated yet, right? It hasn't like kind of brought everything together. So like if you then like go and ask the language model, what the answer is at that point, it might be able to like infer what the answer is from the information it's got, but it might not necessarily be explicitly representing it. Potentially, this is a possibility here, I guess. So okay, what if instead of doing this, we actually, like I said, if we ask the language model for an answer? So this is the second approach that I looked at. The second approach for measuring beliefs, which is to just prompt the language model. So we take a chain of thought, maybe like half a chain of thought or something, right? And give it to the language model, say, hey, given this so far, what do you think the answer is? And see what it says. Of course, the problem here is kind of the flip side of the issues with linear probe, which is that now we are actually giving it time to like kind of pull the answer together, where maybe before it didn't know what the answer is, right? We're kind of changing the context a lot. We're giving it, we're letting the language model kind of do a lot more work, like we saw in the paper I mentioned earlier, right? Where we're kind of letting the language model do a lot more work to get the answer, which isn't necessarily what we want here. So the third approach I looked at is just kind of sampling from the language model to see what to see like what the distribution of answers it gives is. So what I mean is that you take a partial chain of thought and then you just generate a bunch of continuations from that point, right? Just keep on generating until it reaches the end at some non-zero temperature or whatever, and measure the frequency of answers that it gives. But I think this is kind of, conceptually maybe not really what we're looking for, I think. The problem is that, the kind of answers distribution that you get like at the end of the chain of thought doesn't really necessarily have a direct connection with like what the model is thinking about right now. So you could have a scenario where the model's like made some mistake, right? Partway through the chain of thought. But like if you run a lot of continuations from there, it might actually be able to correct that most of the time, right? So if you just look at the final answer distribution, you'd see, oh, the model is getting the answer right most of the time. But if you look at, if you had a better measure of like what the model is thinking at the moment, you would see that it's actually, made some mistake there. So I don't think this is quite right, but I did, run some tests with this. Yeah, so I guess all three of these methods are sort of like, I think they're sort of measuring, somewhat different things. They're asking somewhat different questions of the language model, right? So the linear probes are mostly asking like what the language model is explicitly representing at this particular, token or whatever. The prompting approach is saying, what is the language model able to, or what is it likely to infer about the answer, given like this partial chain of thought that it's like processed or generated or whatever. And of course, sampling is doing something somewhat different. It's asking how does the current like chain of thought, how does that influence the final distribution of answers that you get if you continue the chain of thought process. Yeah, so I think these are all kind of asking somewhat different questions. But yeah, I thought it would be interesting, I guess, to see what sort of results they give, and ended up looking at all three of them. So okay. Yeah, so just some implementation details, I guess, before we get into results. So I'm going to be looking at a data set of basic arithmetic questions. Actually, the examples I showed earlier were from this data set. All of the problems have three options. I'm using a series of 5 models of different sizes. One kind of quirk here is, for some reason, the 1.8 billion model does a good deal better than the 4 billion model. I'm not really sure why that is. I think the smaller models can just be kind of finicky. I don't really know what's going on with that. But the larger models do have very high accuracy on this task with chain of thought. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. But even the smaller models, though, they're doing better than chance, right? Chance here would just be 1/3, and they're doing a good deal better than that. Yeah, okay, so let's go into the results. Yeah, so the first method that I'm going to talk about is prompting, because this actually ends up being the simplest one. So just to kind of elaborate on the methodology here, so we collect a bunch of chain of thought responses to these arithmetic questions. Going to split them up into sentences. You could also look at like splitting them up by like every 10 tokens or whatever. But splitting into sentences is kind of a nice logical division of the chain of thought. And then at each like sentence break, at each point where you split the chain of thought, I'm going to generate a new prompt where we give it the partial chain of thought and then ask the model for the answer immediately. Also give it some few shot examples in this format with these like sort of partial chains of thought, so it knows what it's supposed to be doing. And then going to get the probabilities that the model assigns to each of the options at this point. And yeah, this sort of gives you a sequence of probability distributions, right? So at the end of each sentence, you can look at what the probability distribution over the possible answers is, right? So look at what the model thinks the answer is at that point. Going from none of the chain of thought, right? Just giving it the question, and then increasingly adding sentences until you get the full chain of thought. I think I actually cut out the last sentence of the chain of thought typically because at the end of it, the model will typically just say, and the answer is A or whatever. So I don't think it didn't really make sense to include that there. But yeah, so here's kind of just an example of what this looks like. So we have our question here, the 3 options, and then answer. Let's think step by step. And then we've got one sentence of the chain of thought, right? And then a ... to show the model that like this isn't, the full thing. This is a partial chain of thought. And then we ask it for the answer. As I mentioned, there are also some few shot examples, which I kind of didn't include here. But yeah, I think in this case, yeah, the model didn't really get this one right. It thinks B is the most likely option for some reason. Anyway, that's fine. Yeah, so okay, so that's kind of the basic setup. I'm going to look at some results now. So I've got a bunch of these plots of like the raw data. I will have some like summary figures later on. But in some cases, it is actually kind of useful to look to like have an idea of what the raw data here looks like. And but I will kind of just like flip through these for the different models somewhat quickly. This is for like the 0.5 billion model. So the thing to look for here is yeah, actually, sorry. So on the x-axis, right, we're just plotting the fraction of the chain of thought that we go through. They're all kind of different sizes. I think for one of the models, it ended up getting stuck in the loop, and there's like a chain of thought here with like 100 sentences or something crazy like that. But most of them are kind of reasonable sized, I guess. And then on the y-axis, I'm plotting the log odds of one of the answers. So on the left-hand side, I'm plotting the log odds of the answer that the chain of thought picks. So each of these lines here is a single chain of thought, a single question, right? And it shows the probabilities kind of at each break in each sentence break. And specifically it's showing the log odds of the answer that the chain of thought ends up picking at the end. Whereas on the right-hand side, we're looking at the log odds of the correct answer to that question. So these are just two different ways of viewing the data. Log odds, by the way, is just log of p over 1 minus p. It gives a nice kind of like linear scale to work with probabilities. I just kind of found it convenient to view the data in this way. Yeah, so the thing to look for here is that in the left-hand plot, we're generally going to see the traces kind of go up towards the end of the chain of thought. This kind of indicates that when we do this kind of prompting procedure, it's giving a higher probability to the answer that the chain of thought will actually end up picking, which is what we want to see. Sorry, I forgot to mention the colors. So the colors indicate whether the trial, the chain of thought got the answer right or wrong. So the orange plots are showing trials where the original chain of thought is incorrect, and the blue trials are trials where it gets the answer correct. Yeah, so on the left-hand side, we're generally going to see both of those go up towards the right-hand side here. Whereas in the right-handed plot, the blue trials will generally go up because the probability it assigns to the correct answer, is going up. Whereas on incorrect trials, the log odds of the correct answer will go down, right? Because it's picking a different answer. So generally, you're going to see a split here on the right-hand side plot between the blue and the orange trials. What you do sort of see here, it's not so obvious with this smaller model. Yeah, it's somewhat more obvious with some of the other models. Yeah, was there something else I want to say? Oh yeah, so the blue trials are actually the same in both images, right? Because the correct answer equals the chosen answer on the blue trials, which are the correct ones, but the orange trials could be different. Yeah, okay, so these plots are maybe a bit confusing, but I will have some kind of summary figures later which show the data in a bit more easy to digest format. But just to flip through these briefly, so here's the 1.8 billion model. The 4 billion model, you can see it's got more orange because for some reason it's doing worse. And then the 7 and 14 billion model, they mostly get the answer right, so they're just mostly blue. There's this weird split here. I'm not entirely sure what's going on with this. There's a lot of kind of weird details in these plots, but yeah. So here I've just plotted the average probability that gets assigned to the original choice, meaning the choice, the answer that the original chain of thought picks. So that corresponds to the plots on the left here. And yeah, so we can see here, pretty clearly that towards the end of the chain of thought, the models assign a higher probability to the answer that the original chain of thought was going to pick, which is good. This is what we want to see. It also seems to be more prominent for the larger models. That's the lighter colors here, the 7 and 14 billion models. So that's, good. This is, I guess, more or less like what we want to see here with this. But even for the, even at the beginning of the chain of thought, it's still significantly above like 1/3, which would be, just random. And because these are kind of like average probabilities, even if it's like only a bit above 1/3, this could actually translate into a pretty high accuracy. I don't know off the top of my head what the accuracy would be if you translate this into accuracy, but this isn't necessarily like terrible even down here, I guess. Okay. So those are kind of the basic results that we get with the prompting technique. It mostly kind of looks like what we'd expect, I think. So next, I wanted to try to apply the bounded rationality model to this. So let me actually kind of describe what this model is. So I'm working with this sort of information theoretic bounded rationality framework. There's a lot of theory here. I'm not going to go into any of it because it's not really important, and there's a lot of it, as I said. But essentially, what we do is we model the probability of picking an option using this equation here. So we have a prior. This is a sort of prior distribution over the possible options. That's the Q here. And then the probability is going to be proportional to an exponential, specifically this exponential of U, which is a utility function of the different options, and this constant beta. The Z here is just like a normalization constant to turn it into a probability distribution. So yeah, beta sort of acts as, it's like an inverse temperature. They call it like a rationality parameter because essentially it governs how rational, so to speak, the agent is being. Because if you use like beta of 0, then you're basically just following the prior Q, right? Whereas if you as you kind of increase beta, you start increasingly optimizing the utility function. So in the limit, this will just be like trying to pick the maximum, the option with maximal utility. But this is sort of meant to model an agent that like might have a utility function, and might have some utilities or whatever, but it's just not necessarily always very good at picking the best option, or maybe it doesn't like devote maximal effort or whatever to picking the best option each time. So it sort of interpolates between following some prior and trying to maximize the utility. So the way I implemented this, I parameterized it like this. So the alpha parameter just kind of, that's just the prior. I just brought it inside the exponential. And then we have the beta and the utilities. So the prior, alpha, and the utility, those are indexed by the option, right? Each of the answer choices that we have. So 1, 2, or 3. But they're constant over the steps of the chain of thought, right? And whereas beta is like going to be the same for each of the options, but it varies by step. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to fit a model of this form to the data that we get from prompting, right? So we've got all of these probabilities for each like sentence in the chain of thought, right? For each like step of the chain of thought, we have these probabilities that we got from prompting the model, and I'm going to fit a model a model of this form. Sorry, model is kind of an overloaded term here. But I'm fitting this sort of equation to the probabilities that we get. And then I'm going to be looking at the residual, right? The sort of loss that you get after fitting. Whatever's left over that this doesn't explain. And the hope, what we'd like to see is that the residual loss decreases with language model size, right? We'd like to see that the larger language models are better fit by this model. That would kind of indicate that their chains of thought are maybe more coherent in some manner. So I actually ended up looking at 2 different versions of this. One is where I just set the first beta value to 0. That's to make sure that the alpha actually captures the prior, right? And the other beta values are sort of unrestricted. The other version of the model, I again set the first beta value to 0, but then the other beta values, I kind of restricted them to being like an increasing sequence. The point is that, like, as the chain of thought progresses, as you kind of add parts of the chain of thought, you'd expect the model to do better and better at like picking the answer. which corresponds to kind of increasing beta and more strongly optimizing some utility function over just going by the prior here. At least that's the idea. Yeah, okay, so what do the results look like? So this is just plotting the loss after training these, after like fitting these models. And yeah, it's mostly just noise. I think it doesn't like show any clear relationship between language model size and the loss. So this is for the first model with kind of unrestricted beta values. I think, yeah, I've also got the loss for the other version of the model with positive beta values. It doesn't really, yeah, it still kind of doesn't really show any clear trends. I think technically, if you like look at the correlations, one of these is positively correlated with model size, and the other is negatively correlated. You know, you can try to guess which one is which, I guess. But yeah, I don't think like there's not much here. The correlations are very small with language model size. Yeah, so that's kind of I guess disappointing. I don't think these are doing a very good job of, or at least, you know, the hypothesis that this would vary with language model size doesn't seem to be the case. The results here are just pretty weak. And yeah, one other problem, I guess, with the just with the prompting probabilities as well, with getting probabilities from prompting the models, is that if we go back a few slides to this plot, you can see that like over here, the smaller models, like even at the very end of the chain of thought, they don't do a very good job of like picking the answer that the actual chain of thought gives, right? So this, I'm not sure these are like very reliable, I guess, for the smaller models. I think basically like the small models are kind of just like not very good at like interpreting the chains of thought. So yeah, I think they kind of like add a bit more noise to the measurement just because like they're not very good at this task. Which I don't know, maybe that is like a component of what you want to be measuring here. I'm not sure, but yeah, it does seem that like this isn't like super reliable way of like measuring the probabilities. Yeah, I did do some other work along these lines, trying to develop like a simpler model of a simpler way of measuring the coherence of chain of thought, because like this whole process with the bounded rationality model, like fitting these parameters to the data and then looking at the loss is kind of complicated. So I did do some work trying to like find a simpler way of doing this. I'm not showing those results here because they're also pretty inconclusive. Yeah, the approaches I took were kind of like ad hoc, and they've got other issues. But yeah, there is some, I guess, other stuff here that I'm not going to go over. Okay, so let's go on to the second approach that I took, looking at sampling. Yeah, so the approach here, right, is I think somewhat more straightforward. You essentially just you know, as before, we split the language, the chain of thought into different sentences, and then at the end of each sentence, we just generate a bunch of continuations with, you know, some non-zero temperature, and look at the distribution of answers that you get. You know, after doing this, measure the proportion that pick each of the answers. Okay, so let's look at some of these results. These plots are not super informative. I'm now actually plotting the probability, the raw probability, rather than the log odds, just because, you know, here we actually have like proportions of some finite sample, right? Yeah, so these aren't super informative. Looking at the later ones is a bit more obvious, right? Here we can again see that, you know, on the left-hand side, the probability the probability being assigned to the answer that the chain of thought ends up picking goes up more or less towards the end of the chain of thought for both the correct and incorrect trials. Whereas if we look at the probability of the correct answer, on correct trials it goes up, and on incorrect trials it goes down. This is more or less what we'd expect to see. Yeah. Okay, so here's again the sort of summary figure. Again, this is the probability assigned to the original option that the original chain of thought ends up picking. So we can see it sort of does go up towards the end of the chain of thought. although it's maybe somewhat, not a very large slope. Some interesting notes here, though, is that the larger models, especially, they very often just pick the same answer that the original chain of thought gives. But I think this is like, in part, this is like confounded by accuracy, right? Because you can imagine if the larger chain of thought, the larger language models, excuse me, if they're just very good at giving the right answer, then they're going to be doing this regardless of what the beginning of the chain of thought is, right? But it turns out that even if you do look at even if you split up the data by like correct and incorrect trials, so the solid lines here are correct and dashed lines are incorrect. At the beginning of the chain chain of thought, right, for the larger models, the probability is like basically around 1/3 or a bit over that. But towards the end, it does actually increase. So I think there is some signal here, because even looking at like trials that it gets wrong, there is some consistency in terms of which answer it gets wrong, right? Which of the wrong answers it picks. So I think there is some signal. It's not just entirely confounded by accuracy. But it is kind of an issue with sort of interpreting this data. And in fact, this model, this approach kind of has a lot of issues. The probabilities again tend to saturate, and a lot of the probabilities that we get are, you end up getting like zeros and ones, because we're just looking at like a finite sample of responses. And this means that we actually can't really apply the boundary rationality model, at least not like straightforwardly, because that sort of works in a log space, right? And so we can't take the logarithm of zero probability or whatever. There are also, of course, the various conceptual issues with sampling that I mentioned earlier. So, okay, I'm not going to go into more with this, but because there are various issues here, but yeah. Okay, so let's now look at like the last approach that I looked at. So this is using linear probes. So here, what we're doing is we've got some chains of thought. We look at the model activations at some particular layer for every token in the chain of thought, and we train a linear probe that is just like a simple one-layer linear network to predict the answer that the chain of thought will give at the end of the chain of thought, given these activations at any point along the chain of thought, right? So, we've got some intermediate activations partway through the chain of thought, and we want to try to predict what answer the chain of thought will end with. Okay, so here's some of the data. Now we've got data for every single token, which is nice. So some things to note here. Again, we can see that like, on the left-hand side plot, the answers do kind of go up at the end. It's not really visible for the smallest model for some reason, but for the larger models, it is. And on the right-hand side, the correct answers go up at the end and the incorrect answers go down at the end. For these smaller models, there is kind of a pretty clear division, even very early on, between the correct and incorrect trials, which is pretty interesting. What I think that's telling us is that these smaller models are basically just relying on some sort of prior throughout most of the model, throughout most of the chain of thought, because, even very early in the chain of thought, the linear probe is able to predict which answer they're going to pick, or whether they're going to, whether they're going to pick the correct answer on these trials. So that's pretty cool. By the way, this like weird smooth bit in the beginning, I'm pretty sure that's the text, like, let's think step by step. For some reason, it seems like the linear probes like kind of treats that somewhat separately, or the the activations there are somewhat different or something, which is kind of cool. But okay, here are some of the models. I'm again just going to flip through these somewhat quickly. The larger models have a very kind of distinctive jump at the end, whereas before that it's just kind of like mostly noise. And here's the 14 billion model. And here's the summary figure. So some things to note here. First of all, the range of probabilities is much smaller here. The y-axis is different. So for some reason, this is kind of giving more uncertainty. It's not really picking the right answer very confidently, it seems. again, the probability that it assigns to the chosen answer, the answer picked by the original chain of thought, does go up towards the end, which is what we want to see. An interesting feature, though, which we don't see earlier, is that the smaller models, like these two, which are the ones that get like the wrong answer most of the time. These are the these are the less well-performed models. They assign a pretty higher or a significantly higher probability to the chosen answer, even very early on in the chain of thought. This is what I was mentioning before. We see that in this plot as well, that these sort of smaller models, these weaker models, are more often relying on some sort of prior, I think. Yeah, okay, so that's kind of the basic result that I got with the linear probe. Now I've got some sort of more exciting plots for you. So, oh, sorry, I do actually split this up by accuracy. Was there anything I wanted to say about this? Oh yeah, so this is the effect that you see where the the effect that you see here where the kind of weaker models are more relying where they're assigning a pretty high probability early on in the chain of thought. That's especially visible on incorrect trials, right? The incorrect trials are especially they seem to be especially relying on some sort of prior here. Okay, sorry. The next thing I want to talk about, this kind of ended up happening sort of by accident, I think. But what I did was I trained a linear probe to predict not the final answer, but the sort of intermediate responses that we get from prompting the language model. So the methodology here is kind of complicated, but we get these chains of thought, we split them up by sentence, prompt the language model to give us like, a distribution at the end of each sentence, like we talked about earlier. And then we train the linear probes to predict not the final answer, but these sort of intermediate answers, right? What's the end? What answer will the language model give at the end of each sentence? Yeah, and the results that you get here are actually really, really strange. So, okay, the 0.5 billion model looks more or less similar, but here's the 1.8 billion model, and it's doing all sorts of weird stuff here near the beginning of the chain of thought. It's very kind of strange looking. And the 4 billion model is even weirder. It's got all sorts of strange behavior here. Then the 7 billion model is mostly normal, although it does have this kind of like weird lower split in the trials. Some of these trials are kind of in this like lower cluster here. And then the 14 billion model is again mostly just kind of noise until it gets to the very end. But these two, the 1.8 billion and the 4 billion, they're doing something really strange here. So what I did was I broke it up by number of sentences in the prompt, in the chain of thought, I mean. So when there's only one sentence in the chain of thought, it looks pretty normal. It is over here on the left. But then when you've got two sentences, for some reason, the first sentence gets split up into these two clusters, which then kind of collapse back down for the second sentence. And then for 3 sentences, it's again the first sentence that gets split up more or less. And then the later sentences sort of come together. And again, for 4 sentences, it's like the first sentence. So for some reason, the 1.8 billion model here, which is what we're looking at, the first sentence, it seems to get split up into these clusters unless there's only one sentence. Then it sort of doesn't do this. Yeah, which is very kind of bizarre. The 4 billion model is maybe even stranger. So what it's doing here, it still has these sort of divisions for later sentences, right? There's still this sort of split between the different trials. But you've also got these strange peaks like over here and here and here that look like they're at the end of each sentence. So it's got this sort of very strange division in the sentences. Yeah, this is very confusing. And I don't really know what's going on with this. So for one thing, I'm not ruling out this is some sort of like bug or whatever. Obviously I've been over the code however many times, but it's pretty complicated, the procedure for training this. So I can't really rule out that this is just some technical issue. If we do kind of take this seriously and ask like what this implies, the best kind of explanation I can come up with is that like maybe there isn't like a single subspace that represents the language model's beliefs throughout the entire chain of thought. Maybe there's like multiple subspaces that the beliefs sort of like move through as you go through the chain of thought. and for some reason that transitions tend to happen at the end of sentences or something like that. And so maybe like the linear probes are when we kind of train them on these intermediate probabilities, it's sort of like helping the linear probes like pick out some of the subspaces that are relevant for the like earlier in the chain of thought. Because maybe the linear probes like can't capture like the entire space that it's working with, like only like one of the linear subspaces or something. That's kind of a vague hypothesis as to what's going on, but I don't really know. This is really kind of confusing to me. And so if you have any kind of ideas or discussions about this, I'm happy to talk later about this. But yeah, this is kind of very confusing. So yeah, just to wrap things up, I went over 3 different ways that I tested for measuring the beliefs of language models during chain of thought. So prompting seems to work pretty well for the larger models, I think. At least the probabilities that we get look pretty reasonable. For smaller models, maybe a bit less so, but yeah. Sampling, I guess we saw that had some difficulties, both kind of on a conceptual level, and also, I guess, various practical difficulties. And the linear probes, as we just saw, they're fairly complicated. There's definitely something going on here, but I'm not sure what. We also looked at the bounded rationality model to try to measure like how coherent the chain of thought process was, and that didn't work so well. At least it didn't seem to be very correlated with language model size, which is what I was hoping to see. So yeah, going into the future, I guess the first order of business is to really figure out what's going on with these linear probes, because yeah, it's there's definitely something there, but not sure what yet. I'd also like to work a bit more with the bounded rationality model, because I don't know if like the reason it's not giving me a sort of correlation with language model size is that some limitation of the model, is it some limitation of the data set I'm working with. So I'd like to, kind of explore that a bit more. And I'd also really like to kind of explore connections between this work and some other, really interesting work in related work. So for instance, work done by some PIBBSS people actually on like applying computational mechanics to look at the beliefs of language models. I think it would be really cool to try to like explore connections between that and the results I've gotten. Really disappointed that I didn't get a chance to like go into that this summer. And there are also various mechanistic interpretability studies on chain of thought that it would be cool to explore connections with. Yeah, okay, and I think that's all I have. Yeah, thank you very much for listening. Thanks to PIBBSS Fellowship for giving me this opportunity, and to my mentor and all the other PIBBSS fellows with whom I had a lot of really interesting and useful conversations. If you want to talk about the presentation or whatever, I'm going to be here I can take questions now or later in the breakout session, or you can email me or whatever. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Baram. All right. As a reminder, audience, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask your question directly, or if you prefer, you can type it in the chat or in the Q&A function. In the meantime, while the audience is coming up with questions, unless there's an immediate one, there's not. Yeah, how optimistic are you on mechanistic interpretability solving alignment overall?
Well, that's a big question. Solving alignment, I not very. I guess I mean it certainly seems useful in a lot of cases to have a good idea of what's going on inside language models. Having more knowledge never hurts. I'm somewhat skeptical, I guess, of the more like kind of totalizing visions, I guess, for mechanistic interpretability in terms of like providing a complete solution. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think definitely having some sort of understanding of what's going on internally is useful. I think it's part of the puzzle. I don't know that I'm like very qualified to like have a strong opinion on like big picture will mech solve alignment or whatever, but that's I guess my personal opinion. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the hot takes.
Yeah.
Let's see. Wojtek is sending claps. Thank you very much. Yeah, Wojtek has a question.
Can you hear me fine now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. I was wondering, sorry, so the context is surely there are cases where it would be like really hard or misleading to try and get the beliefs from the system kind of mid computation.
Yeah.
So like maybe all the work that you have here should be making some sorts of assumptions on like kind of what sort of stuff the model is doing, how it's reasoning. Were you thinking more explicitly about like what those assumptions are, or
Yeah,
when
no, that's a
you expect this to be reasonable and when not?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely something I've like been kind of thinking about a bit over this project. I don't know if that I have like a good, strong answer to that. But yeah, I mean, certainly like, you know, in some cases, if the model is doing something more like, you know, Bayesian reasoning or whatever, where it's got some you know, if it's like explicitly trying to like estimate something and like collecting evidence or whatever for it, then it would you know make more sense. Whereas you know, if I think um I was talking with another fellow about this, I think, and like, you know, if the model is like uh uh, you know, I mean, if you imagine like how you know humans might like think through some problem, maybe they'll like explore one direction and then say, okay, what about like this other direction, or like you know correct themselves and go back and forth. And in that case, you know, we're really you know it's not really clear that like there is like an answer to what the it's not clear that like trying to measure beliefs there will like work at all. And yeah, definitely like it's not entirely clear like if there is even a meaningful answer to whether language models have beliefs yeah, in the middle of computation. And to some extent my results I think maybe suggest that's not like a meaningful answer. I mean, if you look at like say you know these plots, like this just looks like total noise for most of this, you know. Meaning that like the linear probe isn't really able to say very much about like what the model is thinking about. But I think I do get like some results showing that like you know in some cases there does seem to be some meaningful signal there. So I think in some cases it is like reasonable to say that. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know that I have like a good answer to like exactly what assumptions you would need for that to take place. Yeah, I mean, I think like in this case, the problems that it's working with are pretty like simple, you know, arithmetic problems that like it can do like one step at a time. And you know, I think it's somewhat reasonable to like say like, okay, you know, at the beginning of the problem, maybe it doesn't like maybe it's just got a uniform distribution, and then it like does one computation and sees like, okay, one of the answers is just like an order of magnitude off or something like that. We can rule that out or something, and then like narrow it down like that. But I also think that arithmetic problems is maybe not the best case, not the best scenario for this. I ended up kind of working with this, just kind of working with this data set just by chance, I guess. Uh, Probably, if I were going to do this again, and I had more time on my hands, I would probably like want to come up with like a more structured data set where I could like, you know, where we'd more explicitly expect to see like in intermediate beliefs where that like makes a bit more sense
Right.
than arithmetic, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it definitely varies by the problem that it's working on, and I think it's like not totally unreasonable in this case, but it could definitely be better, I guess.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Any more questions? We have a few more minutes. Yeah. Tamas, go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation and for all the work, Baram. I really like the presentation. I'm really curious where where it will go on. I'm curious. Can you say more about like the connection to computational mechanics? Because that sounds really fruitful and interesting connection. So do you
Yeah,
have
I mean, I don't have, much to say about it, which is why I put in the future work here, right? I mean, I think like my understanding of it, I again haven't like done a really deep dive into it, but my understanding is that it's they also use linear probes to measure beliefs of language models during some task. And yeah, computational mechanics is some sort of formal framework that they use to analyze the beliefs and like found this sort of like structure in the results of linear probe results that or in the activations using linear probes. They use the linear probes to find this sort of structure that the theory was predicting in the beliefs. Yeah, I don't have like much more to say about that. I guess because yeah, I haven't gotten a chance to really go into detail, but it looks very interesting.
Yeah, that does look very interesting, and I'm also wondering how they deal with the problem that like possibly not all tokens in the language models actually contain the belief, that some of them are like just perfunctory, like closing
Yeah,
brackets and stuff.
I think they were...
we discussed that earlier. So I'm wondering like maybe they have also tools to deal with that.
Well, I think they were working in a kind of artificial setting, where they just like trained the transformer to do like a kind of like artificial task, I believe. Don't quote me on that though, but I think they might not have like had to deal with like that kind of issue.
Thanks.
And we have one very quick question.
Hi. I was wondering if, so this is very much in line with yesterday's news of the O1 models, and I appreciate if
Yeah.
I had a chance to look at them much. But it seems that what they're essentially doing is some sort of process supervision, which is looking at chain of thoughts and like training a reward model to reward the chain of thoughts rather than, or individual steps in the chain of thoughts rather than the outcome. And it seems like that would be very interesting to like rerun experiments with some process supervision chain of thought with the bounded rationality model specifically, because like you were thinking of individual steps as like some sort of proxy for like optimization power.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that would be really interesting, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I put the slides about O1, but I haven't like I don't know much about like how they trained it or whatever. I don't know if there is much public information, but yeah, no, I mean, I'm not super familiar with the process supervision kind of thing, but that does sound very an interesting direction to look into for connections to this.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much, Baram, for the lovely talk, and thank you everyone for attending.